Welcome to Microsoft Build 2017. My name is Archana Nair, and I'm a Senior Program Manager on the PowerApps team.
And I'm Steven Siciliano. I'm the Principal Group PM Manager for Microsoft Flow.
And thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking about PowerApps Flow and how we can extend them by integrating with pro developer tools such as Azure Functions and Logic Apps. So let's get started. Here's the agenda. We're going to start off with an introduction to PowerApps and Flow. And then we're going to look at some demos where we can build PowerApps and Flow by connecting to various data services such as SharePoint and Common Data Service. And then we'll look into extending the functionality in PowerApps and Flow using Azure Functions, Logic Apps, and API management. Now, before we dive deep into what is PowerApps and Flow, I'd like to take a step back to see where does PowerApps and Flow fit into the bigger picture. So as we know, data is at the core of any business. This could be customer data, employee data, it could be marketing or financial data. What businesses want to be able to do is to be able to measure the data. They want to be able to act on the data, take some actions on it, and finally be able to automate the data using tasks or workflows. This is where Microsoft's Business Application Platform comes in. Microsoft Business Application Platform has a Power tier which is geared towards our power users. Who are power users? These are citizen developers or business analysts, and these are people who are not core developers. However, they have a really good understanding about the business data. They understand the scenarios that exist for the business users, and they also have enough skills to put together experiences for the business users. So in the Power tier, we have Power BI, which provides insights and analytics on the data. And we have PowerApps, which we're going to talk about more today. And PowerApps takes those insights and converts them into useful actions. And then we have Microsoft Flow, which also we're going to talk more about today, which takes those actions and converts them into tasks and workflows that can be automated. Now, because there are limits to what can be done in the Power tier, and we don't want our power users to hit a cliff and not be able to implement certain complex operations, there's also the Pro tier. And Pro tier is geared towards our pro developers. And Pro tier basically allows you to do the same three functions, which is to measure, act, and automate, but allows you to do that on more complex systems. And finally, like we said, data is at the core of any business. So we have the Common Data Service, which is basically Microsoft's standard set of business entities that ships out of the box with the Power tier offerings. And there's also an SDK available that you can use to connect to it from the Pro tier. And finally, if you have data that exists in your existing systems that you can use connectors that ship out of the box with the Power tier to connect to them. You can also use our on-premises data gateway to connect to data that exists on-premises. So today we're going to be focusing more on PowerApps and Flow and how you can extend these functionality by integrating with Azure Functions as well as Logic Apps. So hopefully that gave you a big picture view of where PowerApps and Microsoft Flow kind of fits into the business application platform ecosystem. So now let's see, what is PowerApps? So PowerApps is a SaaS service that's used for creating and using custom line of business apps across platforms. So what does that mean? It means you can connect to data no matter where it exists. It could be in the Common Data Service. It could be in your existing systems that you can use with our connectors. Once you're able to connect to the data, then you can build apps and forms and workflows without having to write a single line of code. That's the best part. Once you have, you can use your PowerPoint skills to drag and drop controls onto a canvas, and they can use Excel kind of formulas to build complex business logic into the app. And once you have the app ready, you can publish your app to the cloud. And once it's published, you can share it with an individual, you can share it with your team or your entire organization to have it instantly available for them to start using across mobile devices, that's iOS, Android, or Windows, or even the web. What's Microsoft Flow? Microsoft Flow is a SaaS service that helps you to work smarter by automating workflows across your apps and services. What are the various examples where you can actually use Flow? You can use it to get notifications anytime a file is updated. You can also use it to keep your various data sources and files in sync so that you always have the latest version of your files. You can also use it to collect business data and organize it. And then finally, you can also use it for automating approvals and getting instant notifications and alerts. And this is just a few of the examples, and Flow can be used in many, many more scenarios. And Stephen's going to show more demos later as well. And like we said, connections is a core part of PowerApps and Flow. We already ship over 100 plus connectors out of the box with PowerApps as well as Flow. And this is all the way from SQL and SharePoint to Office 365 and Salesforce to Trello and Wunderlist, and the list goes on. If you have data in on-premises, on say SQL on-premises or SharePoint on-premises, you can connect to that as well using our on-premises data gateway. And then finally, if you don't have a connector to your system where your data exists, you can create your own connector. And that's what we call as the custom APIs, which can connect to any REST endpoint. So that brings me to the end of the slides. So let's quickly jump into some demos. So here is a demo scenario. Okay. Contoso is a company that manages senior housing communities. So they own and manage about 15 plus buildings, and they have over 100 residents. There's a regional manager in Contoso who is responsible for making sure that the seniors living in their community, their needs are taken care of, and their issues and concerns are met. There's a community manager in Contoso who is responsible for actually visiting these residents in person and making a list of the issues and concerns that they have, and making sure that they get resolved. So this is the community, and let's see what their existing process looks like. So I'm using CM as short for community manager and RM for regional manager. So the community manager visits these residents and makes a note of these issues. And potentially, this is a manual process where he's taking down notes in a book or something of that sort. And then when the community manager is at the resident, there is no easy way for him to get additional information about the residents. When is their rent due? When is their lease ending? Because that potentially exists in another old system that he doesn't have access to while he's visiting these residents. Then once he makes a note of all the issues and concerns, the community manager then comes back to his office potentially and manually has to enter these issues into a SharePoint site. Once it's input into the SharePoint site, then the regional manager on a regular basis goes and reviews the SharePoint site for any new issues that have been input, and then approves them or denies them appropriately. And the community manager then goes back to the same SharePoint site, looks for approved issues, and emails the set of issues to a technician who can come out and fix those issues. And then finally, once the issues are fixed, again, the community manager has to go back and manually update the status of the issue. So as you can see, this is a very manual process and obviously not very efficient. Now, what we want to show in this demo is how we can automate this entire process and make it more efficient by using PowerApps, Flow, integration with all the pro developer tools that we have. So let's switch over to our demo. All right, so here's the SharePoint site that the community manager uses to input all the various issues and concerns that the residents have provided. As you can see, it's got a number of columns, it's got a category, it's got the details of the issue, a status of the issue, contact of the residents, and some additional comments. Now, the first thing I'd like to do is to be able to build a PowerApps on top of the SharePoint list that will allow the community manager to easily create new issues as well as update issues. So one way of doing this is starting right from the SharePoint list. As you can see, there is a PowerApps button right here. I can go ahead and click on it, click Create an App, provide a name for the app, and get going. What I'd like to show you today is actually creating a Power App from PowerApps Studio. PowerApps Studio is a native Windows app that is available in the Windows Store for download. The easiest way to start building an app is what we call as starting from data. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my SharePoint list and copy the site URL, which I'll be using in a bit. So since I know my data exists on SharePoint, I can go ahead and select SharePoint right here. And if you did not have a connection set up to SharePoint already, this is the point where you would be prompted to provide your credentials. Since I already have a connection, all I have to do is provide my SharePoint site URL. When I click go, it gives me a full list of all the various SharePoint lists available on that site. So I can just scroll down, and resident issues was the list that we were just looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and click connect. So at this point, what's happening is PowerApps is going to create a default 3-screen app for me. So this is the first screen includes a browse screen, second screen includes a detail screen, and the third screen is a edit screen. And it's done already. And I just want to emphasize the fact that this is already a fully functional app that I can actually save and the community manager can potentially use. So I can actually go into the preview mode. And if you can see, this is, I can scroll. I can even select one of the items, look at the details. By clicking on the edit button, I can actually edit the fields. If I make an edit here and actually save it, it does go back and update the SharePoint list. I can also go back to the first screen, click on the plus button to add new items. So as you can see, this is already a fully functional app. All right, so now let's take this a step further. Let's say the community manager not only wants to put these items into the SharePoint list, but he wants to have context of which resident he's visiting. So in order to do that, I'm going to bring in one more SharePoint list. And this is the list that I want to bring up. And if you can see, this has the building names on the left in the title column, and it's got apartment, which is the unit numbers as well. So in order to bring in that as a data source, I'm going to go ahead and back into my Power App and click on Add Data Source. I'm going to again go back and select my SharePoint list. If you put in the URL this time, I'm going to go back and select resident buildings, which was the table that we were just viewing. So now it's available to me as a data source, so I can start building an app with it. So let's go ahead and add a new screen. If you see, there's a new screen button on the left here. And I'm going to go ahead and move the screen to the top. I can potentially give the screen a different color very easily. I can change the fill. And I'm going to insert 2 drop-down controls. So you can go to the Insert tab and select Controls and drop down. And I'll show you how easy it is to build simple logic into your Power App. So if you copy, I'm going to copy and paste another one because I want 2 of these. So in the first drop-down, what I want to show is a unique list of the various building names. So for that, there's a formula called distinct. I'm going to use that. And the first parameter is the actual data source, which is the resident buildings table. And the second one is the expression that we want to, is basically the column name, which is title. And just that, and let's see, so the data is coming back. Then the second drop-down, what I want to do is I want to only show the apartments in this drop-down for the specific building that was selected in the first drop-down. So in order to do that, let's use a simple function again, where I'm going to use a filter function. And the source is again resident buildings. And in this case, the logic that we're going to use is we're going to say the title in this table, I want it to be equal to the title that was selected in my first dropdown. So we can say dropdown 1 dot selected dot value, and I want to show the apartments. So as you saw, this is a simple logic that we've built in. Let's go ahead and give this a try. So I can select any building name, and as you see, the unit names are appropriately changing based on that. All right. Now let's add another control where I want to navigate to a new form so that the community manager can start putting in new issues when he's visiting the residents. So I'm going to again go back to Insert and Icons. Let's scroll down to pick an appropriate icon. This is the people icon. And you can easily, again, change the color of it. Just one click. Going to insert it here, and I'm going to go to the property called onSelect. And on select, what I want to do is 2 things. One, I want to make sure that we create a new form, because this is for not viewing existing data, but to create new data. So for that, there's a formula called new form, and edit form is our the form that's available in the edit screen. And then there's another formula called navigate, which basically helps me navigate to the page that I want to go. So we can put in the screen name and choose any transition if we want, and that's it. So let's go ahead and give this a try again. So I can select any building and unit, and if I click on this, it took me to a new screen. All right. So now let's take it one more step further. So let's say when the community manager is visiting the residents, he'd like to see more information about the name of the resident, when their lease is ending, when their rent is due, etc. All this information is now stored in CDS, which is our common data service. So I've gone ahead and created a custom entity, which I'll show you here, called resident info, which is in the common data service. And as you can see, it's got all the resident information. It's got full name, it's got unit number, lease information, lease start and end date, how much rent is due, etc. Now, in order to bring this and show this inside of PowerApps, now I have to create a connection to the common data service. So let's do that again. So let's go back to the data sources pane and click on add data source. And I already again have a connection to common data service. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And I'm going to search for resident info, which was the custom entity I created. And when I click connect, I bring that into PowerApps as a data source. Now, instead of making calls to the service for every column that I want, what I'm going to do is, based on the specific resident that the community manager is visiting, I'm going to go ahead and get the entire row from common data service and store it in memory so that it's easy for me to bind it to any control in PowerApps. So to do that, what I'm going to do is, for the screen that we're viewing right now in the edit screen, I'm going to go to the on visible property. And what I'm going to do is, on visible of the screen, I'm going to use a function called clear collect, which collects data into in-memory collection. And let's give a collection name. Let's call it resident collection. And what we want to do is basically use a lookup function where we want to look up into the CDS entity, which is the resident info table. And the condition is that the unit column in the resident info table should match the specific unit that was selected in our very first screen's dropdown. So that's dropdown 1_1. That was the second dropdown. .selected.apartment. And that's it. So let's go ahead and give this a try and see if this actually works. So I'm going to go try the app again. And let's say I pick a random unit and come into this page. And now the way to see if your collection actually worked is you can go back to the file menu and go into collections. And as you see, one whole row from my CDS table is now available in memory. And now it's super easy for me to go ahead and bind this to any control I want. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a bunch of text boxes here so I can start showing the information. And to do that, super easy. So I can say this is name. And I want to get the first row from my resident collection and get the full name property. And let's go ahead and copy paste a couple of these text boxes so we can get some more information. And now let's go edit some of them. So let's say the next one I want to show is apartment. And I believe this was called unit. And let's also show rent due. As you see, this is super easy to do. Once you have the information that you need in a collection, it's child's play. So, all right. So you saw how easy it was to bring in data sources from SharePoint and kind of mash it up with the data available in the common data service. Now let's take it a step further. Let's say the way the community is set up is that their utilities are included as a part of their rent, and they have some logic to figure out what the next month's utility bill is to get an estimate of it based on certain inputs, such as the number of people living in the residence and the average temperature for that next month, etc. So what we've done is we've gone ahead and implemented an Azure function that actually helps calculate that. So I'm going to switch here to the Azure portal. And as you can see here, it's a very simple Azure function. It basically takes in two inputs, which is a base rent and a tenant count. And then it's making a call to an external service to get the average temperature for the next month. And once it gets that, we have another custom logic, which is going to calculate the rent based on all these various inputs. Now, in order for us to call this Azure function from PowerApps, what we need is a custom API. Like we said, custom APIs are nothing but RESTful APIs that can connect to any REST endpoint. And all we need to register that custom API inside of PowerApps is basically a Swagger definition file. I've already gone ahead and created a Swagger definition file that is here. And as you see, it's basically got one method. It's called getNextMonthEstimate. It's the same thing. It takes in two parameters and returns the actual estimate. So let's go into the PowerApps experience, where I can show you how you can create a custom API. So you can go into PowerApps.com and go into the Connections tab on the left and click on Manage Custom APIs. I do want to call out that the experience that you'll see here when I click on Create New Custom API is an experience that is going away within the next week or two. Stephen's going to show you the new advanced custom API experience that's coming to both, that's already existing in Flow and that's coming to PowerApps just within the next couple of weeks. So the way to register a custom API is, since I have an API Swagger definition file, I can go ahead and select that and I can click on Upload. I select the Swagger file and we can give it a name. Let's say Rent Estimator. If you have an icon, you can provide an icon. If not, we pick a default icon and you can provide any description that you want for your API. So let's say get next month's rent estimate. Go ahead and click Next. Since my function did not have any authentication, there is nothing else for me to configure at this point. So I can just go ahead and click on Create. So at this point, an actual connector, a custom connector that we call as custom API is getting created, and it should show up in my list of available connectors in a second. There you go. Once the custom API is created, the next thing that I have to do is going ahead and creating a connection to it. So as you see, 6 seconds ago, this is the one that I just created. I can go ahead and click on the plus button here. This is creating a connection. Go ahead and click Create. Now, once this connection is created, I can go back to my Power App that I was building and again bring this in as a data source into my Power App. So let's try that. I say add data source, and let's look for the new connection that we just added, which was Rent Estimator. And it should be available as a data source in a second. There you go. And now I'm going to copy paste another text box here. And this is where I want to show the rent estimate. And the method that I want to call is get next month's rent estimate. And this is basically calling into the specific function that we just created. And the first input parameter is base rent. Let's say it's 1,000. And the tenant count, again, if you remember, my collection that I had the tenant count. So I'm going to call that. So, and I think it was called number of residents. There you go. And that's it. So let's see if this works. And there you go. So I got the rent estimate back. So as you saw, we built a Power App connecting to SharePoint list. We brought in another SharePoint list as a data source. We brought in CDS and showed that data in here, and also showed you how easy it is to connect to an Azure function from Power App. So I'm going to now hand off to Stephen, who's going to continue to add and extend this app some more.
Great, thanks. That's a great demo. So what I'm going to be talking about is taking the SharePoint list that we already have and adding the approval logic on top of that for the manager to make sure that there is an appropriate process in place that doesn't require a bunch of manual work by to do the approval. So I'm going to switch over to the demo here. And now what we're looking at, this is the same SharePoint list that you saw before. And you may have noticed there's a button there called Flow. If you've never clicked this before, what this does is this is a great entry point from right inside of SharePoint to get started and create a flow. So I'm going to select Create a Flow right now. What you're looking at now is a set of SharePoint templates that are unique for this particular list. That means that these templates have a flow already configured for them. So they can, for example, send an email when something is added to the list, or when an item is added to Dynamics, put something in this list. For the purposes of the demo, though, I want to create a flow using a custom action. So I'm just going to click on that right now. Now, what will happen is this will pre-populate the first step in the flow with this SharePoint list URL, as well as the name of the particular SharePoint list. So you can see that here. Now, a flow has two important concepts. It has a trigger and it has actions. The trigger in this case is the item being added into the SharePoint list. So that's when the community manager notices that there's an issue somewhere. And then the action is going to be get the approval from the regional manager. So that's going to be me. So I'm going to click Add Action, and it's going to show me a list of all of the different actions that Microsoft Flow has available. I can click See More, and I can browse. We have over 125 different services that we can connect to today, and all of those services have a bunch of different actions inside of them, so very, very wide breadth of connectivity. So when I select approvals, it shows me all the actions that our approval service has. In this case, there's just Start Approval. It's pretty straightforward. And now it's showing me the set of inputs that I need in order to successfully start an approval. So it has things like a title and who the approval is going to be assigned to. When I select title, you may have noticed this dynamic content popover has come. And the dynamic content inside Microsoft Flow is extremely important because that's the data that's passed from the steps previously available inside the flow. In this case, all of the columns from that SharePoint list that we were just looking at, the category of the issue, the email of the resident, are available to me, and I can include them in this approval. So for this case, let's just include the issue category. We'll include the subcategory, and we'll say it's for, and then we can have the resident email here. And what these boxes, these blue tokens mean is every time the flow runs, it's going to be a different category, obviously, and that will have the appropriate data populated. You don't have to use the tokens, though. You can also hard code a value directly into the flow. Since I'm the only regional manager, I'm just going to put my email in for filling out who the approval goes to. And finally, I can include additional optional fields. In this case, I'm going to include a comment. The comment is provided by the community manager when they went to the Power App and filled out that option. So there we go. I've completed configuring the approval step. But that's not all. I have to actually do something when the approval comes back. So that's where the concept of a condition comes in. The condition allows me to evaluate any of the outputs from the previous steps and to use that as logic to determine which steps to run or not. In this case, I'm going to use the response from the regional manager, that's me, and I'm going to check to make sure it's equal to approved. Approve. Next, I need to add what is actually going to happen once I've approved it. And in this case, we're going to send an email to the community manager and the technician. So I'm just going to search for mail, and this shows me all of the different mail options that we have. I'm just going to send an email, pretty straightforward. As before, I can use any of the data from previous steps. So in this case, I'm going to use the person who created the SharePoint list item because that's the community manager. I'm going to say, the request for service approved, as well as I'm going to provide in the email body some details. So in this case, the regional manager, filled out some comments in the approval, so I can include those. Oh, and I should also say, what unit the item is approved for. So that's it. So now I have a full approval process that's built out that I could go to the SharePoint list right now, add a new item, it would send out an approval, and then if I approved, and only if I approved, send an email. But what's really powerful about the business application platform is that you can bring in data from other services, and you can actually leverage very tightly Azure API Management, as well as Azure Logic Apps, in addition to Azure Functions, which you just saw a little while ago. So in the case here, the property management company actually has an old legacy API that stores the history of routine maintenance on units. And that API is exposed through Azure API Management, which is what I'm looking at right now. Inside Azure API Management, of course, there's a bunch of different APIs that we have, and one of them happens to be the Unit Info API. Now, this API, I'm the regional manager. I didn't create this API. This was made by some guy that I hired for IT to do this for me, but he exposed it to me, and now I can start calling it when I build my flow. To use an API from API Management, I can simply click on Export and choose Open API Specification. That's the new name for Swagger. And that downloads a Swagger file directly to my desktop. So the process for this is going to be just the same as it was for the Azure function. I need to upload this as a custom API. So first, let me save this flow so I can come back to it in a minute. And then I can come over to the custom API page. So this is the custom API page inside of Microsoft Flow. I can select Create Custom API, and I can upload the Swagger file that I just downloaded. So I can select that here. I can give my API an icon. And then what's great about the new custom API experience inside of Microsoft Flow is you can add additional information to make it clearer what the API does, what the inputs to the API are, and what the outputs of the API are. In this case, the API management instance already had some basic description information in it, but I can add an additional summary. So I can say, this returns the unit maintenance history. Likewise, I can configure the set of inputs to the API and the set of outputs to the API. So there's an optional header. I don't need to include that, so I can just remove that parameter. And in this case, in order to connect to this API through API management, I need to provide an API key that my IT guy gave me. So that here I can say, the API key from IT. It's just check your email. So I can save this, and that's it. So I have to give it a friendlier name, unit info for property, and click Create API. So this is now saving the custom API. Once saved, this will be available just like the Azure function was. So I could use this inside of a Power App, or I can use it inside of Microsoft Flow. The other thing I want to show is how you can use Azure Logic Apps to connect to services that you write in a serverless way that have additional logic. So functions, as you saw, is very simple. You can just fill in a few lines of code and get it working. But with Azure Logic Apps, you don't even need to write any code at all. You can actually build a full, simple API from just dragging and dropping UI elements onto a canvas. Logic Apps is basically the pro dev equivalent of Microsoft Flow. And as such, you can use Logic Apps from inside Visual Studio, which is what I'm showing right here. So there's a Visual Studio extension that allows you to edit, create, and manage your Logic Apps from right inside of this client. So this is a Logic app that I created. It just adds some additional logic so that way I can, for example, depending on the issue type of the maintenance, I can add additional annotations. So I can say, don't forget to turn off the main before servicing if it's water. I can continue to edit this from right inside Visual Studio. So if it's a power-related issue, I can add an action, for example, to respond with a different response, to remind them to check the fuse box, for example. So let's try that one more time. I can see all of the services here. The services that you use inside of Logic Apps are many of the same services that you have inside Flow, but there are additional ones that are unique to Logic Apps. So for example, if you're doing business transformations, you can use a variety of different XML capabilities and B2B services that are available in Logic Apps, but not Flow. In this case, though, I'm just going to do a simple response, and I'm going to say, check the fuse. And then I'm going to save this. The one other thing I want to show is Logic Apps, because it is targeting the IT guy, the pro devs who have Visual Studio, there is also the concept of a code view. And inside the code view, you can actually manipulate the exact definition of that logic app. And you can add additional steps, you can copy paste, you can add additional logic that may be difficult or impossible to build in this simple UI designer. So you can see that I added, for example, the check the fuse step that automatically showed up here very simply, and I could actually modify this and it would go and update the designer. In this case, though, we're all done here, so I'm going to go ahead and deploy this logic app to Azure. So this is using the built-in deployment capabilities of Visual Studio. And in fact, because this is in Visual Studio, I could have now actually checked this into source control and used Git or whatever source control management I want to use in order to manage this. But I'm not going to dive into that quite today. There are other sessions that cover that type of thing. So now I have a couple things that I can include to enrich this flow that I've created. So I'm going to come in and edit this flow. I'm going to add those other pieces of information. So the first thing I'm going to add is the call the logic app and get back that additional annotation. With Flow, you don't need to use a custom API to talk to an endpoint. You can actually just call directly that endpoint using this HTTP card. So I can say I'm going to do a post. I'm going to go grab that endpoint for that logic app that was deployed right here. I'll just copy that, paste that in. And then what I'm going to pass it is I'm going to pass it from the subcategory of the issue of the SharePoint list. And it's going to do that logic that I wrote in Visual Studio to determine what additional message. And then I'm going to add the response from that logic app to the body of this email message as well. And then the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in that building information that I added as a custom API from the logic that was made available to me. So you can see unit info for property. This returns the unit maintenance history. This is that friendly label that I gave it so I could remember what it was. And it automatically created a connection for me very easily. And again, there's this label that I provided inside of the Flow UI. And I can just put in the API key that I have, as well as the resident info. So we'll add the resident email. And then I can use that information inside of the send email step as well. So now that we've, I need to save, so that way we actually get this saved. So now that we have this flow created, you can see it's now enriching data that's made available to me through these awesome Azure capabilities. So the last thing I want to show is just I'm going to come over to SharePoint. I'm going to save one item into this SharePoint list. And so that got added. You can see I added water, so we should get a note about the main and not a note about the fuse box. Barb, example, some water is leaking. So if I come back to the flow here, you can see now that the flow is running. It picked up almost instantly that there was a new item added to that SharePoint list. And I can click on this and I can see those details. You see the water that's pending was that particular item. And then what it did is it sent an approval to me, the regional manager. So what I can do now is I can come to this, and I can see all of the approvals that are pending on me. Remember, it was barb@example.com was what I just filled out. This is the new approval center inside Microsoft Flow. So any approvals that are created for my organization will actually show up here. So it's a single consolidated view for approvals. And I can choose to approve or reject. If I rejected, then nothing would happen. But I'm going to choose to approve the request. And I can now add additional details. So I can say, this is a great resident. And then I can confirm the approval. So that's how easy it was for me as the regional manager to use this approval that I configured inside of the flow. And if I come back here, you can see that it indeed called the HTTP endpoint, got the details of the water. And you can see it has the comment to not forget to turn off the main. And then finally, it emailed the technician with this additional details. So in just a few minutes, I was able to create this process that actually goes and connects to a bunch of different APIs. It uses API management as well as Azure Logic Apps to get more information. And then the email gets sent off, And finally, it's all connected to that same SharePoint list. So the Power App and the Flow all work together to automate what used to be a very painful manual process by using both the Pro and the kind of business user-focused tools. So in summary, somebody with only minimal technical knowledge, really not any coding at all, was able to easily create both a Power App and a Flow that connects together a bunch of different services into a single place. You saw how you could customize Power Apps using those formulas that are Excel-like, so they're very easy to use. You don't need to have any coding experience. But if you do have the ability to call into your IT department and have them expose an API for you, or you are a developer and you want to expose APIs to other people inside of your organization so that way they can get that power, you can actually do that very easily. And you saw 3 examples, one with Azure Functions by just going to the Azure portal, one with Logic Apps from inside of Visual Studio, as well as using an existing API management and just copying that Swagger file over, or Open API file, and including that inside of Microsoft Flow's new custom API experience. So I hope that this session has been very helpful for you. Please take a look at Power Apps and Flow for your business solutions and see how you can use the services that you build in Azure to extend and make Power Apps and Flow even more useful for your scenarios. You will be able to check out a bunch of different sessions on Channel 9. We have a number of sessions here at Build, and I would strongly recommend checking them out if you found this session interesting. So thanks a lot for your time, and yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good day.